Hi there. For this drawing we're going to be diagramming and actually shading a sphere, but I wanted to show you a few photos first just so that you knew what we were talking about when I refer to certain things on the sphere. So there's a couple of ways you can light your ball or your egg or whatever you end up choosing as your spherical object. One is to use diffuse light. This is in this photograph. You have a really soft light source. So I had turned off all the overhead lights in the room and I had opened up the window blinds and it was north facing. So the sun was not shining directly in on the object, but some light was just bouncing off the sky into the sphere. So you can notice that the area where the light and the dark meet is a really soft, blurred area. There's not a really crisp line that distinguishes where the direct light ends and the shadow begins. The other thing you should notice about diffuse light is that the cast shadow, which is the shadow that's on the pink piece of cloth underneath the ball, has a really soft focus outline. So you would have to be blending and blurring, and you notice it gets blurrier and fuzzier as it gets farther from the ball. The ellipse is fairly crisp when it's very close to where the ball is touching the fabric, but it gets softer focus as it moves further away because light is bouncing in around the edges of that shadow and kind of eating away at it. This one has a fairly even half lighting, so the ball is almost half in light, half in shadow, but the light source is definitely off to the upper left side of this ball and it's coming in at an angle. So you can see how stretched out that cast shadow gets. The cast shadow is much longer than the ball is wide. So you're kind of estimating the angles of the rays of light when you're starting out to diagram your images. Okay, this example shows backlighting. So this is almost like a phase of the moon where you see just a sliver of light. This can tell us that the light source is on the far side of the ball coming in from the back side. And really we've got almost probably 90% of the ball in shadow and we're just seeing a sliver of light wrap around the edges. But notice how far down that crescent shape goes. So if we track the points of that crescent shape of light, they're going to touch just about through the widest part of the ball there. So a lot of times students misjudge the size of that crescent shape of light when they're doing their backlit sphere. And again, we're in diffuse light, so the cast shadow that's near us is kind of dissolving away at the edges. There were also 2 or 3 windows open when I shot this photograph, so we're almost getting 2 different directional light sources, one from the window slightly to the left, one from the right, so they're almost canceling each other out. So it's pretty hard to see the cast shadows on the tabletop in this image. We're still in diffuse light setting here, and but we're still slightly backlit. So you can see less than half of the ball is in light, more than half of the ball is in shadow, which implies that the light source is still more on the back side of the ball than it is on the front. And you notice the light source is pretty low too, so we've got long shadows again and a soft focus edge between the shape of light and the shape of shadow that hits on the ball. This one, now we've moved around the ball. So now I'm in between the ball and the light source, which is the window that was behind me. So you can see that now we have a crescent shape, but that crescent is a shadow. It's not a shape of light. So if we were to try to map out that crescent shape of shadow, it also, the tips of that crescent are going to meet at a point that runs right through the middle of the ball. So we'll be diagramming that out in our sketch as we're laying it out. But we're still in soft focus here. We've got diffuse light. The cast shadow is kind of a blurry edge. And so you can choose diffuse light, but you might have a little bit better light chance of plotting out that ellipse if you use a stronger light source. So here I closed all the windows in the room. I put a really strong light on the ball from above. So it was almost like a spotlight. And you can see that my eye level is pretty high because that ellipse of the cast shadow that's underneath the ball is quite a bit rounder than it was in some of the other photographs. So the higher your eye level is above the thing that you're drawing, the more that ellipse is going to be tipped up and we'll see it closer to a circle. It's certainly not ever going to be a true circle unless we were standing right above the ball or saw it in some other weird angle. But I want you to notice that in this case we see it as a little bit stronger circular form. So I'm going to be using this image as we're doing the drawing demo, and I'm going to push it off to the side, and I've so that you can kind of imagine what I'm seeing as I'm drawing. We're going to start out with our pre-toned paper. I've already toned an extra sheet of this white drawing paper using vine charcoal. And the first thing to do is think about the size that you want this ball to be. So I do want you to make sure you can fit the cast shadow that's on the tabletop in your drawing, so don't draw it so big that we can't see the shadow. I also want you to include a little bit of the edge of the table. So I want you to position yourself as you're drawing your egg or your potato or your volleyball or whatever you're drawing so that it's on a tabletop and you can actually see some ground plane but also some either wall plane, or just if you're out in the middle of the room, maybe it's just a dark background there so that we can have some more a way to surround the top side of the ball with darks. So I'm just going to lightly sketch in, approximation of where that dividing line of the background is going to be. And then with the circle, really it's just a true circle. So do your best to just draw a big circle. If it helps you to use your skewer to kind of make sure it's not too lopsided, I feel like mine's wider than it is tall, so you can just kind of keep working that out until you get a pretty round shape, and we'll have some chances to kind of adjust those contours as we go too. But do your best just to kind of make a nice light circle there. We're always using vine charcoal for this initial diagramming. Please do not use your compress because you'll have a really hard time getting rid of these lines if you use the wrong kind of charcoal. So the next step I want to do is locate the very center. So again, you might use your skewer just to kind of help you keep that dot as close to the middle of that circle as you can. And that's going to help us think about our rays of light. So in this example, because the crescent of shadow is kind of shifted around the ball, I know that the light's not directly above it. I know it's slightly to the left. And in real life setting, you could actually look at where the light bulb is and judge, is it to the right or left of where the ball is, so that you have a good sense of which way you want those lines to go. So what I want to do is maybe kind of imagine where those rays of light are. The other thing that can help me figure that out is looking at where the shadow falls relative to where the ball is. So if you can imagine two lines coming in from, I'm seeing my video in mirror, so I'm always orienting my hands the wrong way, but we're going to have some rays of light kind of coming in from the side, so you can lightly draw those in. I'm thinking it's maybe not quite as steep as I first drew it there. So we're kind of imagining all these parallel rays of light coming in. Whatever angle you're thinking the light's coming from, we're going to try to draw a line that's perpendicular to that. So we're kind of looking for a 90-degree angle there that should go right through the middle of the ball, and that is a line that the crescent shape has to touch. So it's going to be perpendicular to that line of the light, and we also want to try to keep this part, because the cast shadow has to fit between these lines as well. So I'm going to check. I feel like it might be a little wider at the top than it is at the bottom. Yeah, it sure is. So I've got something off here. I'm going to try to... When your paper's laying flat on a table, sometimes it's hard to judge the angle without being right over it, but I don't want to get in the way of the camera, so I'm seeing my drawing from a little bit of a weird angle. But that's a little bit better, just trying to square up those angles there. And then the other thing I'm going to do is do some measuring. So looking at the ball, I'm guessing that about a third of it is in shadow and about 2/3 of it is in light. So just kind of estimating this distance, if we pick about 2/3 of that distance, kind of estimating approximate thirds here, take 2 of those, and we want to kind of have our crescent shape. So the crescent's going to touch the center line, the points of the crescent, and then 2/3 will be in light, 1/3 will be in shadow. The next thing I want to do is try to estimate the size of this ellipse. And when I measure the height versus the width of that ellipse, it's about twice as wide as it is tall. I also am noticing that the ellipse doesn't start way down here at the bottom of the ball. It's actually surrounding the ball. So if I think about a point directly below that midline where the ball might actually be touching the ground, I have to make sure that my ellipse shadow surrounds that contact point. I can't draw it way down here or it will feel like the ball's not quite landed on the ground yet and there's some like a shadow that's dropped down below, but it's not resting right on it. So you do want to make sure that your cast shadow is actually intersecting the circle of your the ball itself. So I'm noticing things like, I know it needs to fit between these lines. I'm also trying to estimate how far up, like if this is where the shadow is, how far, if I could see through the back edge of that ellipse, how close does it come to that edge of the shadow? I think it's still going to fit a little bit below it, but that's maybe fairly close. So whatever the width is, I need to make sure the height is about half of that. So let's kind of see how close we are. Okay, we're a little bit off. I think maybe I need to go a little bit rounder here. The other thing I can do is I can treat these things like negative shapes. So I can look at what the curve is here between the angle of the ball and the angle of the shadow. I can measure distances like this. I can measure the distance here, compare it to something on the ball. You know, I'm going to measure across the widest part of the shadow and see, is it as wide as the ball or how much wider than the ball? And yeah, it's just a hair bigger than the ball is, so maybe I need to bring it out a little bit more. Okay, I'm also looking at this angle. This doesn't look quite right. I've got it almost an acute angle, and I feel like it's going to be closer to a 90-degree angle, so maybe I need to bring it up even a little bit higher. So even though I can't see this part of the ellipse, I want you to really think about it, because otherwise this curve might not make sense with the rest of the ellipse. So you'll be looking at your shadow shape and kind of correcting things as you go. Okay, let's assume that we're kind of getting close now. All right, so let's go ahead and start doing some blocking in. I like to get the darks in early, so since the background's really dark, I'm going to flip my drawing around so I can see what I'm doing here, and just kind of quickly, I'm going to work a little faster on this than I want you to work so that we can get through this demo without being here for an hour. But just kind of quickly, you'll always use the side of your charcoal. I'm not drawing in lines here. I'm blocking in shapes of value. So always use the side of your charcoal instead of the tip of it, and you'll have a lot less problems getting rid of those lines in the end. You don't want any outlines in this drawing, because in real life, when you're looking at the egg or whatever you're drawing, there's not a black outline around it. There's not a white outline around it. It's just one shape of tone next to another shape, and it's that contrast between the neighboring values that allows us to see the edge of the form. It's not a line. So what's tricky is we're used to drawing using line, and here we're trying to avoid all lines in the end. I mean, we're using them as our initial guidelines, but in the end, I don't want any of these lines to show in your final drawing. So we're going to be rubbing them all out. And in the ball, I'm going to be looking for a few different values. So I'm going to be looking for the brightest highlight, which is usually, like if the light's coming from here, the highlight in this case, because we've got front lighting, is probably right about here. And then we're going to be feathering that out from that point using the kneaded eraser. So I usually just sort of work from that point. We don't want this part to be stark white, because then we won't be able to see the highlight against the stark white. White is as bright as we can go. So if you have everything white, it's going to get really flat. We need to have a little bit of a very light gray left on that light side of the ball, so that when we see the true highlight near it, the highlight has to be the very brightest white of all. So save a little bit of tone on these areas, even though you might think that white side of the ball is all white. It will only, the highlight can only show up if it's surrounded by something that's not quite as white. So remember, the kneaded eraser can only lift so much charcoal off. If you really need a bright white, switch to a harder vinyl eraser. And these little, some really rigid erasers sometimes work a little bit better. If you've done all you can with your erasers and it's still not bright enough, you know, sometimes students will buy a little piece of white Conte or white chalk, and at the very end of the drawing, add just a tiny bit of white there. You don't want to be drawing with white chalk over dark areas, or it makes a really weird bluish gray that doesn't match with the rest of the drawing. So do as much with the eraser first and only use white chalk if you absolutely can't get the drawing bright any other way. I'm going to knock those crumbs off the drawing. And yeah, there's a lot of dust on there. Okay, so that's kind of our basic light. It'll look lighter once we get it surrounded by dark, so don't be too worried right now that it's not quite as bright as it needs to be. The other thing I need to start thinking about is what's darker. So I know this was a white ball in real life, it was a plaster ball. So when I'm putting shadows in here, I need to make sure not to go as dark here as I went back here, because it's still a white object. Even in the deepest shadows, that shaded side of that white plaster ball is going to be maybe step 6 or 7 on a 10-step value scale. It's not going to be a pure black. I'm also noticing that when I took the photograph of this ball, it was on a pink background. So pink is a darker tone than white. So we want to make sure that by contrast, the part of the fabric that's in light should still be a little bit darker shade of gray than the white ball when it's in direct light. So you have to think about the local value, the local color, the color something's been painted, in addition to thinking about how much light is hitting the object. So it's a combination of those two things, the starting color of the object, but then also whether it's in light or shade. So you've got to analyze quite a bit when you're making these drawings. So I know the shadow that's on this pink fabric needs to be a little darker than the shadow that's on the white object. So if you go solid black here, there's no way to go darker. So that would be too dark. A black here would be too dark. You have to try to restrain yourself and maybe limit yourself to just middle gray. So we're going to start adding a little bit of tone. The other thing I want you to watch for as we're doing this shading on the ball is that shadow is not the same value from edge to edge. If you make it all just a really flat shade of gray, what's going to happen is the ball is not going to feel like it's really round. So in order to make it really feel round, what we need to do is look for reflected light. And that's the light that's bouncing up off the tabletop or off a neighboring object into the shadow side of the ball. So in the photograph here, you can see that there's a little bit brighter light down here. And when you're drawing from real life, you're going to notice it too. The thing about drawing from life is your eye is constantly adjusting its aperture. So your pupils are dilating when you're looking at something in low light, and then when you look at areas in bright light, suddenly they constrict again. And so you're seeing like different amounts of light entering your eye depending on which part of the still life you're looking at. And sometimes that causes students to overestimate how bright the reflected light is, because your eye is, as you start to focus on that area, your eye opens up your pupils and it lets more light in, so it appears to be a little brighter than it really should be drawn. So to compensate for that, what you need to do is squint at your drawing, and that will force you to look at all the value relationships and not to just focus on one shape at a time, so that your pupils kind of stay more consistent. If you squint and you're looking for those big patterns of light and shade, the reflected light should still blend with the shadows. It shouldn't be so bright that it appears to be lit by direct light. So be careful not to make your reflected light too bright. The other thing I want to do is start to blend this a little bit more. Right now I've got too distinct of a line there. It needs to be a little bit fuzzier. And I want it to go a little bit darker right in this area that separates direct light from the reflected light that's bouncing back up there. A lot of another really common error that students will do when they're trying to draw this shadow core, which is the darker part, is that they make the ball go from white to middle gray to really dark gray along the edge, but it's not. It doesn't just get darker and darker and darker. It actually starts really bright. Then the darkest part is actually here, and then it gets lighter again. So watch, don't just get lazy and just start to do a blended tone. Really look at what you're seeing in real life and try to capture those subtle changes in the still life. So I'm bringing in this shadow core. I also want to double check here because I know that when I'm looking at these neighboring areas, I want to try to make the edge of the ball show up here, but I'm not allowed to use a line, so I have to figure out how is it that I see that shape of the ball, and it's because the shadow on the ball is a little darker here than the light that's hitting the cloth. So I'm going to use a very light touch. I don't want to bring in a line. I'm using the whole side of this charcoal, and so I'll squint at my drawing, and then I'll squint at the real object, and you want those two patterns of light and shade to be the same. You don't want to have your drawing way darker than the real object is. So it's a little harder to draw this circle right because I can't just use a scrap of paper and mask things out, so it takes a little bit longer to get the shapes, just perfect. Over here, I think that also needs to be a little bit darker than the floor that's near it. So you're going to do some careful blending. This might be a good spot for using, if you bought one of the blending stumps, or if you have a way to use the end of an eraser, some smaller shape than the end of your finger, which can be a little bit too big of a shape sometimes. I usually don't use these blending stumps, but in situations like this, sometimes it's helpful. Okay, so we do a little bit of blending there. And then here, here it gets tricky because at some point, when you're switching from shadow to light, you're going to end up with exactly the same value that the background has in some area, but it might just be a very small area of the edge of the ball there. So I want to make sure that I'm not letting these points of my crescent shape creep too far this way. Sometimes students will wrap those points way up here, but you have to keep them back where they end up running kind of right through the middle of the ball. So I'm kind of estimating again, making sure I'm not extending those too far. If I do, I can just erase back a little bit, keep the points right on that center line. Okay, it's not looking too bad. It'll start making a lot more sense once we get the cast shadow in here. So this is not pure black. It's a very dark gray, but it's not going to be too solid of a black. I'm using the edge, and I'm pressing a little bit harder on the edge that's closest to the ball so that I get a really nice, crisp, sharp focus at that area of the ball. And do your best not to let it get too lumpy. It's pretty easy to get your circle a little bit lopsided. We don't want to have a black outline around the shadow. That's another really common problem that makes your shadow look way too flat. So try to use the shape of shadow and not an outline of the shadow. You might notice the shadow is in some cases a little darker near the ball because it's blocking more of the light. And then I'm trying to be real careful here to look at the actual object, or the photo of the object in this case, and try to match that curve and still think about, is it coming in at the right angle to continue with that other side of the ellipse on the right side of the ball. And if not, we need to adjust it a little bit. So you don't want a lot of texture here. You want the cast shadow to just really sink down into the ground plane. So I'm going to try to be as careful as I can along this edge. I have to slow down a little bit and then blend that tone out. The tabletop was a kind of a medium value, so the cast shadow that's on that medium value needs to be a step or two darker on the value scale, maybe as many as 3 steps darker, but it wouldn't be a huge jump. So if you had a pure white here, you wouldn't have a solid black as the shadow. It would just be too big of a jump. You have to try to keep track of what color those objects were in real life, what color they were painted or dyed, and then make sure that the shadows and light that fall on that seem believable. All right, so I feel like I might need a little bit softer edge here. You're just trying to match as closely as you can what you see in real life with your object. And if you notice any lumpy areas, you might need to go back in and do a little bit of erasing or a little bit more addition of charcoal. I don't want to spend real long on this, but you can see how you can do some adjusting. If you've got areas like right here, I got just a little bit of the black coming in, you know, be patient and just take your time trying to clean things up. If you see any outlines, try to blend them in. If you can't blend it in, pinch your kneaded eraser. You have to keep folding it over and stretching it to keep it clean enough to make a difference on your drawing and not just smear the charcoal around. But in the end, I don't want to see any outlines. I don't want to see a black outline, and I don't want to see a white erased line. That's just as bad. You have to try to fine tune it so it's really just one shape of, oops, that's way too dark. I'm going to go back in and lift that out. Sometimes if you're worried about putting too much charcoal down by using the actual stick of charcoal, you can just pick up a little bit on your fingertips and dim it down a little bit. So that works real well, especially in here where you want the ball to feel as round as possible. You don't want to have a really big jump suddenly in darks and lights or a splotchy area. So right here it still kind of feels a little bit like an outline. So I'm going to try to just gently hit just that line and not lighten the areas that are on either side of the line. And it seems like there's maybe a little bit of an outline still showing up here. Oh. Okay. The other thing I might do, I mean, again, this edge needs a little more work to try to really kind of make it feel more lifelike. But sometimes if you want the table to have a little bit more sense that it's tipping away from us, what you can do is intentionally soften the focus back there. So your eyes can only focus on one area of depth at a time, and we really want the viewer to stay focused on the ball. So to not draw so much attention back here, you might intentionally blur that a little bit. And what you can do is bring some of that darks from the upper background down into the tabletop to try to push that back edge even further back into space. So if it goes a little bit darker here, and then maybe we do a tiny bit of erasing up near the front to pull that cast shadow up towards us. That's too dark, so you can keep working it back and forth until it's the right value. Okay. Seems like it's a little bit dark there, so again, you just keep like working it back and forth, paper towel or the eraser, and see what you can do. So to brighten this edge up a little bit, sometimes what I'll do is to make it feel like a little more light's hitting right around here, is you can kind of help sculpt that shape of the cast shadow out a little bit more, and then feather this. I don't want a white halo around here, but I've got to, once I get it bright enough, then I have to gradually fade that out. And sometimes just leaving a little bit of charcoal on your kneaded eraser and smearing with that allows you to blend it without having a real obvious white line show up. So I'm just going to keep that charcoal on there and kind of use it to blend that tone out a little bit more gradually there. So as it gets covered with black, keep stretching it and cleaning that eraser. Here I want to try to clean this edge of the ball up so it pops out a little bit more, and then you don't want the viewer to see any outlines or halos around the things. You want it to be a really subtle value difference. So let it fade out, blend with fingers, blend with paper towel, whatever it takes to get those tones just as smooth and beautiful as you can. So squinting your eyes at your drawing or standing up and backing away from it occasionally so that you have a fresh point of view of the drawing can help a lot. There's still a little bit of a lump here on the ball I probably would try to work on if I had a little bit more time. Let's see if I can round it out a little bit better. I keep squinting at the drawing and squinting at the thing I'm trying to draw to make sure that it's starting to look pretty good. I still don't have quite as much of a highlight as I'd like there. I'm going to try my blue eraser and see if it's any better at scrubbing up that. Right. So once you've erased as much as you possibly can, if you still can't get as light as you want, if you have a little piece of chalk or white Conte, you know, you can come in just a little bit brighter. But again, it would just be in that one spot. I wouldn't be starting to blend it here. I just use it in that one location to try to make it feel a little bit brighter. And then maybe feather out a little bit. But there's no charcoal left on there that I was able to erase. It was just the little residue that had worked its way down into the paper surface. Okay, I think I'll stop it there. I'll bring it over where you can see it a little bit better. And again, there's still more work that could be done on this to make it look really nice, but I hope you get the idea.